War is one of humanity's favorite pastimes. It's exciting, the stakes are high, and it feels like when there isn't a good reason to start a war, we make one up. Unrelated photo right here. One of the most important parts of warfare is having better weapons than the other guy. But sometimes those weapons provide such a large advantage that if this were a video game, you'd consider them overpowered. And in some cases, the opposing side would try to literally ban them, like the Model 1897, which we'll get into later. You read the title, so subscribe for more videos just like this, because my channel is tiny and you won't find it again unless you subscribe. And let's just jump into the most overpowered weapons throughout history. What kind of video would this be without my goat, the Trebuchet? Now, while this weapon was unfortunately French, it was also very cool. Now, the first Trebuchets are much older than the ones we usually think of because they aren't French and also aren't that cool. But in around the 4th century BC, the Chinese had invented something known as a mangonel. I should have looked this up, also known as a traction trebuchet. And this basically used a bunch of people pulling ropes to swing a big wooden arm that launched boulders at enemy fortifications. This concept spread westward and eventually was developed into what we typically think of as a trebuchet. Now, the modern version of a trebuchet is called a counterweight trebuchet. And instead of using people like a goofball, it uses a very heavy-weighted object to swing the arm of the trebuchet. This design uses the mechanical advantage of a short thing spinning a really long thing, which is a great way of describing it. I'm a scientific genius. But why exactly were trebuchets so overpowered? Well, it turns out if you want to break into somebody else's castle, they would shoot you with arrows and pour boiling oil on your head, which is kinda bad. But because of the throwing power of the trebuchet design, just using gravity, you could launch a big rock nearly 1,000 feet and beat literally anything else for range. And while trebuchets were very difficult to set up, it didn't matter because all you had to do was set up your soldiers around a fortification and throw rocks at your enemies until they gave up. And also, you could launch dead animals over the walls of their fort and give them all diseases. Trebuchet, my goat. Alright, so while that last weapon, the trebuchet, had a French name, this next weapon was designed exclusively to kill French people. And that is, of course, the fabled longbow. The 100 Years' War was a conflict between the kingdoms of England and France and took place between the years of 1337 and 1453, which if you were counting there, that's actually not 100 years, but whatever. This guy named Edward III of England claimed some land in France and then got some guys together and started invading France, and then they all fought each other on and off for over a century, with some times where they stopped because of things like the bubonic plague, but that's not important. What is important, though, is the longbow. Now, the French were using mostly crossbows, which are actually a lot worse than you'd expect, at least when it comes to range. The British, on the other hand, were using massive bows as tall as 6 feet tall, which, if you're not American, big. They're big. These bows were made from yew wood, which was very strong and allowed longbowmen to put as much as 180 pounds of force behind an arrow. That in the metric system is like a big number. It's also much easier to load a bow quickly, meaning that you could fire one nearly triple the speed of a crossbow. My favorite battle of the 100 Years' War, where the longbow went crazy, is known as the Battle of Sluys. During this battle, the English had about 120 ships, while the French had nearly double that. Obviously, having half as many ships as your ops meant that the English would need to get creative or just have really long-range bows, and they kind of did both. The French had tied their ships together into 3 long lines, and the English maneuvered around them to get an advantage based on tides and wind and stuff. But because the French had crossbows, the English with their longbows had about an extra 80 meters of range and were able to just snipe the French and the English and won the battle by a landslide. The English lost about 500 men in this battle. Try to guess how many French people died in the comments, alright? Pause the video and subscribe as well. 3, 2, 1. They lost 20,000 people! Bows are lame, which is why our next overpowered weapon is known as the Matchlock. Now, while there were older gunpowder weapons, most were single-use, like the Chinese fire lances, which were basically bamboo flamethrower melee weapons, and while they were pretty cool, they weren't really practical enough to really be considered overpowered because they're single-use, and other than that, they're just a spear. Now, this changed with the Matchlock in the mid-1400s. The Matchlock worked by holding a slow match, essentially just a little tiny fire in place. When the trigger of the weapon was pulled, the match would press down onto the pan holding the powder to ignite the gun. From that point on, it worked like your average, more modern musket. Gunpowder would ignite in the barrel and push a big ball out of the gun at high speed. Surprisingly enough, some later versions of the Matchlock had rifled barrels, meaning it had like a toilet paper roll-esque spin spin design inside of the barrel. Now, what this does is it spins the projectile and makes it significantly more accurate, but I guess whoever designed the musket forgot to add that because muskets weren't rifled pretty much for hundreds of years, and that's why people had to line up in big lines to maybe hit each other eventually, maybe once in a while. Either way, while matchlocks were still pretty difficult to keep around, their range and power made them quite popular. If you had them, your advantage in combat was absolutely massive versus bows, and especially people who run at you with swords and stuff. Not to mention that all kinds of matchlocks and flintlocks and everything like that completely destroyed all types of armor. The one main disadvantage of matchlocks were that they had to remain lit, meaning they created light, and also you could smell them burning from a decent distance away. This completely killed all your stealth stats while having this weapon equipped. Skipping forward now to 1862, we have the Gatling gun, which is the first ever actually usable rotary gun. Now, rotary gun designs are used to this very day, like for example, the big minigun in the A-10 Warthog that goes... Anyway, the Gatling gun was not handheld, it was actually pretty big, but it was considered so powerful by its designer Richard Gatling that he thought it would save lives instead of ending them by reducing the number of combatants in a war. He also created the Gatling gun just to prove how futile war was. Yes, Richard Gatling made the Gatling gun just so people would stop fighting, and guess what? People kept fighting each other and used the Gatling gun a lot. The Gatling gun was operated by turning a crank, which would load a black powder cartridge containing a essentially musket ball from a top-mounted magazine into one of its barrels. Then the next barrel would be loaded and so on as you cranked it. Now you might be wondering why so many barrels was necessary. The main reason is because making little explosions in a little metal tube is pretty hot. And guns at the time were not capable of sustained fire, but because it had so many barrels, the Gatling gun could fire 200 rounds per minute. Now 200 rounds per minute isn't a lot compared to modern guns, but when the musket fires about 2 rounds per minute, you can see where there would be an advantage. Later, Gatling guns could be fired at 800 rounds a minute, and those were more accurate and were mounted onto US Navy ships. And that was still during the 1800s. Everybody else had low muskets that they had to load for 30 seconds, and this one could fire 800 rounds a minute. That's insane. Any version of the Gatling gun was capable of mowing down a huge number of people, and that's exactly what they did with them. Now we're moving on to World War I and the classic trench shotgun known as the Winchester Model 1897. Now, before the United States got involved, shotguns were actually very uncommon on the battlefield of World War I, with most soldiers being equipped with a standard low-capacity internal magazine or clip-fed lame bolt-action rifle. The Model 1897 was the first successful iteration of a pump shotgun ever. The United States had used it during the early 20th century while fighting in the Philippines. The United States had been observing World War I before they officially got involved, and they understood that a powerful close-range weapon was necessary in both defending and attacking trenches, leading them to supply the US military with thousands of Model 1897s. The truly overpowered aspect of the 1897 was actually a design oversight. It was pretty much like a real-life fire rate bug. Now you might ask, what was the oversight that made this weapon so powerful? Well, after you pull the trigger on most shotguns, it disconnects the trigger from firing the weapon until you release it again. This prevents accidentally firing another round if you rack the slide and still had your hand on the trigger. This oversight was noticed and then abused by soldiers who invented a tactic known as slam firing. All you had to do was hold down the trigger and then pump the shotgun as quickly as possible. You essentially had a semi-auto shotgun in World War I. The 1897 fired 9 large pellets of double-aught buckshot, which in tandem with the high fire rate gave the weapon the name trench sweeper because of how broken it was at killing people in trenches. The version used in World War I also had a bayonet attachment, so if you thought getting shot at by a semi-auto shotgun in the 1910s was bad enough, try getting stabbed by the same guy. It was also claimed that the Americans who had used shotguns for hunting birds and trap shooting back in America were able to shoot down grenades out of the sky like a trophy system from Call of Duty. All of this together caused the Germans to call this a war crime to use and petitioned to have all shotguns banned from World War I, and maybe in general forever. Probably because they didn't have any good shotguns of their own. But since this was the same war where the Germans were using every gas possible to kill people, the trench shotgun was considered pretty much fair game. I'll probably include gas if I make a part 2 for this video, and I'll go into all the different types. So subscribe right now because my channel is tiny, blah, blah, blah. Like, seriously, you probably won't find this channel ever again if you don't subscribe. I have like 1,000 subs. It's also funny because trench warfare didn't exist when the Model 1897 was invented. That type of warfare wasn't invented when this gun was invented, but it was so powerful at that one type of task that they called it the trench shotgun forever and ever. Like, if you think of the trench shotgun, it's the Model 1897. Next up, we have World War II. Now, what weapon would be too powerful for World War II? Maybe it would be this. A nuclear fission bomb, which was used in World War II, works by using little explosives to split a bunch of atoms of uranium-235 or plutonium-239. For some reason, when you split these atoms, they create a ridiculous amount of energy and a big explosion. I don't understand how people think it's normal now. By the way, I don't think I have to go into why the nuke was powerful. You guys know it was powerful, okay? Now we have the post-World War II period, and I think the one gun that's destroyed everything else is easily the AK-47 and its many variants and spin-offs. We basically have a whole Kalashnikov cinematic universe, but why is the AK-47 so powerful? Well, the reason it has the number 47 there on the end is because this weapon was first built in 1947, only 2 years after World War II, and it's still in use to this day, everywhere around the world. And keep in mind, the only other assault rifle at the time was the Sturmgewehr 44, which Germany made during the end of World War II. Now, the STG-44 was a great design, but never saw much use. And the AK-47 essentially took this idea of a selectable fire intermediate cartridge weapon and essentially perfected it right away. Like, this was essentially the second assault rifle ever, and it's just maybe the best one. Assault rifles are incredibly powerful because they fire smaller rounds than bolt-action rifles, leading to a larger magazine capacity and soldiers being able to carry more rounds. The AK-47 7.62 by 39mm round is still very powerful, allowing decent performance at range. Basically, assault rifles performed most roles a military could ask for with just a single weapon. Also, full auto rifles with a 30-round detachable magazine were a huge advantage. The best part about the AK-47 is that later updates to the model like the AKM were made with stamped steel, meaning they were incredibly easy to manufacture. The internals of the AK platform are simple and easy to put together and make the weapon hard to jam even when covered in mud, snow, or just about anything else. Now, for modern times, we have perhaps the scariest and also most unexpected weapon of warfare, which is a drone. And not the big drones, I mean the $200 to $300 ones you can buy on Amazon. Why are these drones so broken, you might ask? Well, there's a certain conflict going on in Eastern Europe at the moment where these drones are used for carrying grenades and explosives, sometimes even guns, and also reconnaissance to an incredible level. There's pretty much zero stealth in modern warfare because of the number of drones flying around in the sky. And the worst part about this is if you've ever played BattleBit Remastered, you know what the drone can do, and imagine doing what you can do in that game with a drone at a concert, a sports game. Yeah, if somebody was crazy, even out of the context of war, drones are very scary for the price of them and you know what you can do with them. People have considered some counters to people using drones. One of these is a really powerful, essentially water railgun to shoot down drones, but nobody has figured out how to reliably do it and for a cheap price because they'd probably need to build these into most centers for sports or whatever, any big place basically, because on the ground you can scan people with metal detectors and stuff. You can't do that with the air. Like, if somebody flies something in, you guys understand, right? Yeah, sorry to end this on a bad note, but I thought I would probably need to talk about that. Let me know some weapons you want to see in a part 2 from anywhere in history because I just want to do more. And if you guys did enjoy, subscribe if you're new, but I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.